We're holding at the beginning of chapter 5 in Shaar Yichud B'Emunah, chapter in Tanya's second section of Tanya called Shaar Yichud B'Emunah. The previous chapters have discussed the workings of Chesed and Gevurah, and that's the idea of that is that it's mapped into the concept of the names of Hashem, of Shem Havaya Yud Kei Vav Kei, and the Shem Elokim. Shem Havaya represents Chesed, kindness. That's the translation that we're giving it, which we talked about, which we've discussed in the previous chapter, that Havaya or Chesed represents God's unrelenting connection and giving, as opposed to Gevurah, which relates to the name of God, represented by or the name of God Elokim, and this represents the concept of tzimtzum, reduction. What we talked about explicitly was that how the idea of Gevurah ameliorates the power of Chesed, that it is the power of Gevurah which attunates and reduces the Chesed so that we can receive it. That's the primary idea. The primary idea is that that Chesed, it can be totally overwhelming if it's reduced and attunated and directly, specifically for each place where it reaches. And in our context, we're talking about the spiritual worlds, and including things that dwell in those spiritual worlds and us in the lowest world, so that we can absorb it. We talked about the sun's rays, and if we were sitting on the globe of the sun, we would be totally enveloped and consumed by the sun. But as we're many miles away, and through the orb of the atmosphere of the earth, we get an attunated version. We get a reduced version to what we can accept. So that's the beginnings. That's where we're up to, and that's how chapter 5 starts. Chapter 5 wants to go into more detail in the idea of Gevurah, and the Alter Rebbe starts off with a specific medrash, a specific idea about how the world was created, and then talks about the influx of something else that is a mediating concept, and I'll point it out when we get to it. So the chapter starts off, V'hinei al zeh omer Rabbeinu Zal. So our sages said, and the quote from Bereshis Rabbah, B'tchila olav ha'machshava leberes ha'elim b'midas hadin. Initially, God thought, it rose in his mind, in his holy mind, to create the world through midas hadin. Midas hadin, in our context, is the idea of Gevurah. Midas hadin literally means the attribute of justice, but as you know, justice is a strict justice. So the implication of that is that it's through the capability of Gevurah. But then Ro'o she'eino olam niskayim, and then we saw that the world would not exist, because if Gevurah is taken to its infinite level, then no aspect of creation would exist, because it would be taken to its ultimate point where it's restrictive totally, and therefore nothing gets created. Therefore, the Medrash continues, Shitzapoi midas harachmim, and therefore he combined it with the attribute of mercy. So when I mentioned before that there's a third thing, right? We have that is the idea of the idea of mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is when, in a simple understanding of what mercy is, when we are faced in a life circumstance where someone has some power over us, there might be the idea of absolute kindness, giving away to everything, absolute justice, so restricting whatever might be given to us, and then the idea of mercy, that is an inclination to further allow chesed, kindness, to play into the circumstance, even though the pure aspect of justice might restrict that. So that's the idea. That's the idea of mercy. Now, as we've talked about, that the idea, if we look at the text, it says that God saw that the world would not endure. And what does that mean? That means that the concealment that Hashem would do, the concealment that Hashem would create in this world, would be so impenetrable that we wouldn't be able to connect to God whatsoever. So the name Havaya represents the attribute of kindness and revelation, the joining of Yud Kei Vav Kei with Elohim, the two joining together and ameliorating each other to the extent that there is what we've called in Hebrew rachamim, which literally translates as mercy. Then we bring in an ameliorating factor, and a factor which allows for the connective point to Hashem. So it seems that we might be just talking, or the discussion as it flows seems that it might be just talking about some sort of operational activity. There is chesed, which is a total opening up of the faucet, allowing out a full flow of emanation. We've got a restrictive capability that we've called gvura or tzimtzum, which is restricting it. And what we've said is we can restrict it to not just a large, to a huge flow, but we can restrict it to a small, to a medium flow, to a large flow, to a little flow, to the flow where there is nothing. So if Tzimtzum would go to its ultimate point, then there would be no flow. When the two are joined together, then there is a glimmer of divine light that's allowed into the darkness, so that the darkness is not totally opaque, and that allows us and brings a potential connective point, a way that we can connect into Hashem. And what is the representative of that? The Alter Rebbe then continues and says that is the Hebrew Dahainu Isgalus Elokus Al Yidei Tzadikim V'Asius U'Mefsim Shabbatera. That is through the revelation of godliness. That is, we're making God revealed in the world. And how is God revealed in the world? By the activity of the very special righteous people that we see within them, and through their acts of kindness and their activity, we can see holiness and godliness, or through the activity of miracles, and through the activity of miracles, we can see glimpses of God. Now, why do we say that a miracle is glimpses of God? And if we hearken back to the idea of the biblical narrative of the Exodus out of Egypt, pre that the actual Exodus was the miracles which were shown to the Jewish nation as well as the Egyptian nation of God's 10 miracles which Moses performed, as the narrative tells us, that there were the 10 plagues. Those 10 plagues were visited on the Egyptian nation. The idea of the 10 plagues was not simply that this is a punishment to the people that had oppressed the Jewish nation, but it was a process of recognition by the Egyptian nation that there exists a higher order of spirituality than they understood. And the idea of the 10 plagues, which had a very specific order, and in the teachings of the Exodus, we understand that the 10 plagues were there as a step-by-step process, not just to conquer over the Egyptian nation, but to get them to the point where they recognized, and particular Pharaoh, their leader, recognized that it wasn't that they had the power to enslave the Jewish nation, but they were given the possibility by God for that enslavement. And when God had decided that the time was ripe to take them out, and God commanded via his servant Moses, the leader of the Jews, that it was the time for them to leave Egypt, and he didn't acquiesce, then he was brought to realize that there is a higher spiritual powers. Sure, they thought that they were, that they believed in spiritual powers higher than nature existence, but they thought that that was embodied in themselves, till the point where Pharaoh thought that he said that he was an idol himself, to the point where when Moses came and said that God had demanded that the Jewish people leave Israel, he said, "Who is your God and what is his name?" and said that I don't recognize him. I don't know who that is. He's not in my textbooks of gods. So then Moses started to teach him and enlighten him, and eventually the Egypt nation, recognized the power of the Jewish God. Now, the point why I jumped up to that discussion is that what did those miracles, the 10 plagues, which were miraculous in nature, what did they do? They made a recognition to a human being that there is a higher spiritual order, a higher spiritual power. That is the idea that the Tanya is saying over here, not specifically the narrative of the Egypt, although that's what's hinted to, right? But the idea is that Hashem created the world, and he had initially didn't thought that the idea of that the creation was done with the power of Tzimtzum, but then added in the capability that at times there will be this need for for a recognition of a higher spiritual power of God himself. So that's the idea, that that's the text that we said, through the power of tzaddikim, through the power of our holy and righteous leaders over the many generations, through that and the signs and miracles that happen in the world and that happen to us, but then that we witness to, that teaches us and enlightens us that there is a pathway to God. So therefore there is this idea of a glimmering hint of the transcendent light that flickers in the dark, as the text says over there. And this is something which happens in people's lives, to that you see and that you feel that there is an enlightenment in the world. And as uh, as we know and we can imagine that a person can go into a room, and it can be totally dark, and when it's totally dark, a person doesn't know what's in that room and what potential dangers are in that room. And that's such as life also, that we can, go in the passage of light and not necessarily know which directions to go through a spiritual direction in our life. And then all of a sudden, a spark of light or a ray of light comes through in our lives that gives us a perception or an indication or a direct revelation of godliness in this world. And that affords us a recognition and seeing a vision of spiritual light. So that's the meaning. So this is what the Alter Rebbe said. This is the meaning of the phrase, that initially Hashem saw that it was possible to create the world without, in a way of tzimtzum, of total tzimtzum, that there is no connection to God, and that people have to work their way totally to understand it. But through the addition of through the mercy of Hashem, and this is the idea of the expression mercy, through the amelioration of chesed and gvura, we now have this connective point and understanding of Hashem. So continuing the text, V'hine al zeh omru b'zeham, that's what it says in the Zohar, Dela'elo b'sitra de kedusha ilah, above on the side of supernal holiness, is yamina ve'is smela. There is the right-hand side and there is the left-hand side. And the Alter Rebbe now explains that quote, right-hand side, left-hand side from the Zohar, and says, and continues and says that in the spiritual worlds, just to give you to give you some background in the idea of Kabbalah and the framework of Kabbalah, there is what's called the right side, the left side, and then he explicates and says that the right side is an acronym or a reference to, rather than acronym, it's a reference to the flow, the aspect of chesed, and in the terminology of Kabbalah, this is the sphera, this is the emanating source of God's flow through the Sphirot, the one of Chesed, and then there's the Sphira of Gvura. And he wants to emphasize, and where we're going in general with the whole of Shaar Yichud B'Emunah, of these teachings, that these attributes that we've been discussing, Chesed and Gvura, are really two aspects of the same thing. That meaning that it's two aspects or two revelations of God. So continuing, Pirush, Deshteihem Hein Midas Elokus, Lamaila Mesechel. Um, um, these are attributes which are beyond the grasp of the understanding Hanivroyim V'Hasagosam of created beings, meaning that we can know some detail, but we can't comprehend it because we can't touch and feel these things. It's not the Chesed and Gvura as specific of the godliness representation of it is not within our realms that we constantly work with. And he continues, but in the realm of Atzilus, which is the highest spiritual world, they are one. As opposed to the lower worlds be underneath Atzilus, which have the specific names of Bri, Yetzira, Asiya, which we'll discuss at some point. But to understand that these are the spiritual worlds where the entities which are not totally unified with God, but can start to become separate from God and think that they are their own existence. They exist there. So in Atzilus, Chesed and Gvura are totally united and together, while in the lower worlds, they're not necessarily tightly integrated and are still godliness. They are there, but they're not totally integrated. And again, the emphasis is this is beyond the comprehension of the Nibro, and it is so much not comprehensible that even the greatest of our holy ones, even Moses, didn't grasp it fully, but was only given the capability of understanding of it or attention to it from the lower spiritual realms of the spiritual level of Atzilus, or even lower, as he continues to say that even the comprehension of our great teacher in his prophetic visions and understanding was not of the level of the realm of the fully comprehend the totality of Atzilus, but through Al Yedei Hislabshusei Be'elim Habriya, but only in its how it got enclosed in the lower realms, that is in the world below. So that we said before, that our sages and our prophets like Moshe Rabbeinu and further prophets, all the great prophets who are mentioned in the Tanakh, who are mentioned in the section of the Bible past the 5 books of Moses, but the sections of the books of the Bible, which generically we call Nevi'im, we call the prophets, and then the other section of the Torah, which we call Ksubim. So that's how we have this expression Tanakh meaning the Torah, Nevi'im, Ksubim, which comprises all the books of our written teachings, written meaning through the prophets, meaning through some sort of level of prophecy. And prophecy is a beautiful topic that we'll cover at some point. So and Moses had the most intense level of prophecy. So what the Tanya is telling us, that even though we had many prophets, and as the different names that we are familiar with Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc., even the tzaddikim of the story of the Megillah, where we have Queen Esther and Mordechai. Queen Esther also being a prophetess, right? that also they all had levels of divine knowledge and divine revelation, which we call prophecy. Divine revelation is what we call prophecy. Now, the most so our leader Moshe Rabbeinu, who had the most intense level, the highest level of prophecy, even he didn't understand fully, didn't comprehend fully the spiritual levels that we're talking about. Notwithstanding that, he did, and that's how the Tanya will continue and say that he did have them. He did have this connective point, and we're going to be, and the Tanya is being technical, and then he says through the lower spherot, the lower levels of spirit. As we know, there are 10 spheres in every spiritual world. The highest level of the spiritual worlds, the highest level of the spirit are called Chokhmah Bina Das. The lower levels are called there's middle levels, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, and then we have Netzach, Chayd, Yesod, and the Malchus, which are the lower levels. So therefore, his grasp, Moshe Rabbeinu's grasp, was only through the more lower spiritual levels, which got enclosed in even a lower level, the level below, and that's how that was his connective point. Now, all the prophets that we have listed as our biblical prophets had revelations of godliness, but through the different garbs and enclosements of Tzimtzum, through the idea of the multiple worlds, spiritual worlds that we talk about, Bri, Yetzirah, Sirah. You see, as we mentioned previously, and in different times, the different prophets had, in general, ever decreasing levels of prophecy or direct connection, as it says, as an expression is used, that Moses saw godliness, inverted commas, this is inverted commas, through clear glasses, like glasses, this idea, right? While the other prophets had dimmed glasses and saw prophecy in a lower sense, to the point where it was, for Moses, it was direct communications with God, as opposed to other prophets, where there was less direct communications, and less clear understanding and visibility and understanding of what ideas that they were being imparted.